The other day I was watching Vortrox, a Geometry Dash YouTuber, stream himself playing an extreme demon. Now if you don't know, Vortrox has gotten millions and millions of views super buffing Geometry Dash levels. So it came as a shock to me when I heard him say my own name while I was watching. And what he said gave me an idea.
Today I watched this video by this guy, Emerson or something like that. He has a series where he like makes Geometry Dash icons like scarily realistic. And I really hope he does my icon. I would love to see what my icon looks like if it was scarily realistic.
So in this video, I'm going to be making realistic icons for Vortrox and 4 other YouTubers. And at the end of the video, I'm going to play with them in-game and see how they look. I even got Vortrox himself to react to the icon I made for him live on stream, and you don't want to miss that. So stick around to the end of the video and let me know what you think of the other icons as well. For this first icon, you might not even think of him as a Geometry Dash YouTuber, but in the Geometry Dash community, he does have the most subscribers and the most iconic cube. And of course, that guy is RobTop, the creator of the game. And with this cube being used as the app icon for the game, it's about time that I finally make it hyper-realistic. Now this may seem like a super simple icon at first, but we can do some things to make it really cool. So maybe if I look up an LED screen texture, I can use something like this, and then drag that into Photoshop and overlay it on the eyes here. Looks pretty interesting already, but I want to do it for the mouth as well. So I'll just invert the mask. Now we have this kind of robotic RobTop icon. But we can also use a brush metal texture and overlay it on the entire thing. Now we can paint in this whole area, add RobTop's icon color on top, and then set it to color before we go in with some shadows and then tint these areas dark. And I know that doesn't make much sense now, but you'll see how that makes it look realistic in a moment. Because we can also add a shadow on the top of the LCD screens here, and I'll do the same on top. I'm also going to add in some subtler and softer shadows, and of course I'll add that black shadow around the edge as well. And this is a way that we can make those look a lot more 3D. All you need to do is erase from one corner to the other. Do it for all of these corners, but for the outside I'm actually going to do it the opposite way. You'll see what that does in a second. And now that I've selected the inverse, I'm just going to add an exposure layer and turn it up. Looks like I missed a spot there, and now we have a fully 3D looking cube. You're going to see me do this a ton in this video, but I'm going to warp the brushed metal texture to fit around the outlines. And even though the shading already makes it look 3D, you still need the textures to form around that area to really make it convincing. I'm also going to do that around the entire outer edge here too, and it'll just really help with that beveled look we're going for. Now the shadow looks a bit harsh, so I'm going to lower that gamma correction. And something I'm going to do real quick is add a solid color layer above the LCD screen. Then to make it look bright, I'm going to set it to overlay, and now it kind of fits the main icon colors a bit more. So now all that's left to do is add some shading, which for this one is as simple as painting around those eyes just a little bit on the bottom of the mouth, and then around the bottom right of the body as well. Because I am a Geometry Dash player, you already know that I love glow, so I'm going to hit linear dodge add on this layer. I'm going to name it glow. I can just tap in around the eyes, slowly making my brush bigger as I do so. And it'll make it look like that LCD screen is glowing. But you also need to show that that glow is hitting the sides here. So with the clipping mask, I'll just paint in some blue. And that one was super simple, but I promise you the rest of the icons are going to be a lot more complicated. And remember, at the end of this video, we're going to make Vortrox's icon and get his reaction. But before that, let's move on to an icon that I think you'll all recognize. Okay, so we're back in Geometry Dash, and the next icon we're going to do is Mulpan. I don't know much about Mulpan myself, but their icon does look like a gooey monster, so it's going to be fun to make it realistic. Now, hear me out. I think the first thing we're going to use is actually Jello, because when I see that icon, I kind of think of a slimy, gooey texture, maybe like this. And we're also going to need some googly eyes, and these seem to work perfectly. I don't know if this search is going to work, but we can try big tongue. Maybe I'll look up dog tongue instead. Now this will definitely do the trick. Maybe we also need some sort of mouth texture. I'm gonna blur this out because it is so gross, but I'm gonna use it and then just make it green so that it kind of doesn't look like a human mouth anymore. Of course, we have to name these files, and then I'll drag them into Photoshop. Now first, I'm actually gonna make the Jello this green, and I'll do it by setting this color fill layer to color, or maybe hue, because that looks better. And I'll make this Jello layer bigger and paint in the areas we want to keep. Now that we've covered that area, I'm gonna invert it again. And I'm actually gonna paint in the area that we don't want the icon. I have just discovered that this icon is not symmetrical somehow. I'm gonna turn off the line of symmetry, and I'll just paint it in by hand. But anyway, now that we've painted inside of the mouth, when we hit Control-I again, it'll invert the mask, and we'll keep just the skin. I'm also going to paint in the back of the mouth here. And for good measure, I'm going to overlay the Jello texture on top, and then I'll warp it to fit the shape of the back of the mouth. If we really want this Jello texture to wrap around the object, then of course, we're going to need to go to liquefy. And I'll simply push the edges into the side of it. And we're not going to stop at the outside, because we also need to wrap it around the edges of the inside of the mouth. Now it looks a little better, but we're still going to need to add shading to make it actually 3D. first, we gotta add these googly eyes. We're gonna size them down, put them in their place on the icon, and we'll also need to shrink these pupils a bit. So I've turned the opacity down on this one, and I'm gonna use the Content Aware Move tool. So now when I shrink it down to size, I can hit check, it'll fill in that area. So I'm just gonna use the clone stamp tool, and I'll brush away some of the imperfections. So now that we have the right eye and left eye, let's bring back in the jello, and then get to adding this dog tongue. Now I'm just gonna make a quick selection on it with the pen tool. Now we have this tongue to place where we want. Using this icon as reference, I'm gonna place it here. That looks alright, but I'm gonna have to get rid of this center line so that we can add our own in the future. Now I'm just gonna clone stamp it away. Now we have more of a blob as a tongue. Like the other ones, I'm just gonna paint it in myself. With the center of the mouth selected, I can make the tongue look like it's going back inside of it. And like Mulpan's icon, I'm just gonna make this tongue black and white. Honestly, I'm really excited to start shading on this one, so let's go ahead and do it. Now googly eyes actually have a shadow underneath this pupil, and it's pretty subtle, but we can add it by putting in an exposure layer, and now we can paint in that little shadow underneath the eye. I'm way too scared to start shading that jello, so I'm just gonna shade this tongue first. And I'm gonna pretend that the light is coming from the top right, so that means shadows are gonna be on the bottom left. And with another shading layer, I'm gonna make that crevice that we see. I'm kind of stuck, so I'm just gonna move on to the jello and come back to the tongue later. Now I'm just gonna start by shading it normally, but I will eventually have to change it because jello is very translucent. If light is coming through from this angle, it's gonna come out the other side really harshly. And then use this highlights layer to really make that bounce light pop. I'll also add a few highlights on the top edges of things and on the top right corner. And before I forget, I'm gonna add a shadow underneath the eyes. And as long as it's small and dark, we'll be able to tell where the eye is touching the face. And now something that will definitely make it look a lot better is a dark shadow in the back of the mouth. And because this layer is also supposed to be jello, I'm gonna add some highlights on the edges just like I did down here. And then maybe I could paint in some drips on this tongue. And then for now, I'll lower the opacity to about 30. And I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I think water droplets taper out and sometimes break off from little strands like that. And now I'll add another solid color, and I'll use it to add a super bright highlight on the edges. If you add a highlight on the other side, it starts to look like a water droplet. And the last thing I need to do is just erase this side of the underlying 30% opacity layer. And then I'll also turn its opacity up a little bit. But also, I'm gonna have to put some shadows under these droplets. And because I have no idea how those work, I'm just gonna look up water droplet. And they usually seem to put one shadow on the outside and then refract a bit of light. So we need that dark edge and a very bright refracted highlight. Honestly, I don't know how I pulled that off, but that looks pretty good to me. So I'm gonna go ahead and try it on the other ones too. You know what? Sometimes it just works out because those look awesome. I like how the droplets turned out, but that also means we need to make the tongue look more wet. I think the best way to do that might be to add some highlights to the very top of the tongue. The tongue also looks very cracked and dry, so maybe we can remove some of those. We still do want it to look like a tongue, so I'm gonna leave some in. I'm just gonna use a real tongue's highlights because there's probably no way I would be able to draw that in. I'm starting to think I should also add some slime on this monster. This green slime looks like it'll work great. And then I'm just gonna warp it to fit the shape of that mouth. It's a little bit too even, so I'm gonna get rid of some of these drops. And I think maybe at this point I'm adding a bit too much, so we're just gonna accept how it is right now and move on to the next one. The next icon I want to do is SDSlayers. Ignore this. He uses the finger dash icon, and that's definitely going to look really cool. So let's just get into it. And the thing about this icon is that you unlock it by beating finger dash. So I'm going to take this macro shot of a finger, and of course we're also going to need some eyes. So I'm going to search for bloodshot eyes. These are so gross, but I'll download it. And these teeth look pretty sharp, so let's use some shark teeth. This one is definitely what I'm gonna use. I'm gonna label these files. Let's take this beautiful finger texture and then switch out of this shirt because it's getting hot. So I'm gonna warp this and I'll paint right over the icon so that it only fills up that blue area. And because I'm sure it's bothering you as well, I'm gonna remove this little hair. I'm gonna drag the finger texture back into Photoshop so that I can use it for the bottom part as well. For the eye, I think I'll add this color layer and I'll just paint in a circle there. And with that layer, I can just put this eye over top and use a clipping mask. God. And then we can just copy the eye to the other side, and that looks pretty great. So let's move on to these teeth. And they're already kind of in position, but we're gonna cut them out first. Now in selecting this, I do want to keep these little serrated edges, but if I just hit remove background, it's gonna keep some of the black on the inside, which just doesn't work. So there's something that I can try that I came up with a while ago, and that's going to blend if and just upping the current layer value by a little bit so that it cuts out the black values. And I want to do that until there are no edges. But as you can see, it also delete some of the specks that are dark enough. So we can duplicate the layer, remove that blend if. And using a layer mask, we can just paint back in those areas. And this might not be the fastest way, but it works for me. And I've also added a red solid color so that I can see where the background is shining through. And while I do that, it would be nice if you could hit the subscribe button because we just reached 20,000 subscribers. And of course, if you change your mind, you could always unsubscribe later. And now that we have all of those filled in, we can just combine the two layers with merge layers. Now I'm going to cut out each individual tooth, separate them here, clean up the edges, and now we can use them as those serrated teeth. First, I'm just going to distort them into place using these transform controls. I'll put some on the bottom row as well. Now that we have all those in a general shape, I'm going to go back through and liquefy all of them until they're the exact same shape as the background layer. And I'll just do that by using the background as reference. Now that we've given the icon a nice new set of teeth, it's time to get to shading this thing. I'm going to start out with the eyes here. I'm going to use a really soft brush because eyes are really round. And we'll also add my favorite thing, a bounce light on the edge. We can also add a highlights layer to show that the light is coming from the top left. Now, because it interacts with the eye, I want to add some shading to the top jaw here. You can already see it's making it come to life. And then I can use the bloat tool here and then just push out the skin around there. It might look like it's conforming around the eye a little bit. And then we can really work into the crevices. But of course, because there's shading on the bottom right, we're going to need highlights on the top left. And these are going to show that the skin is protruding above the eye. And with that, I think this top layer of the face is pretty good. And because you already saw me do the top half, I'm just going to speed through that bottom half and then we can work on the teeth. Alright, so I've got the general idea now for the top and bottom, but we have to move on to these serrated teeth, which are going to cast shadows on there, and they're also going to have shadows themselves. So first I'm going to go through all the tooth layers, and I'm just going to add a highlight and shadow layer for each. Then I can paint in their general shadows, and I'll paint in their general highlights. And after we do this, I'm going to give it SD's icon colors. I also want to arrange them in a different way here, because I think it should be just a bit more random. That layering is also going to tell us where we should paint in shadows for where they overlap. Not to mention, I think there should have been some harder shadows underneath the skin in particular. Before we get to adding that extra color though, I'm just going to add some shadows at the bottom and overall touch up the areas. And the fact that these shadows are following the contour of the ridges of this thumbprint is what's really selling the shadow. Okay, now that we've shaded all of it, we're going to go ahead and first make the eyes black. You know what? His icon's actually white except for these pupils. And now that I look, the pupils are actually pointing down towards the middle. Alright, with a little bit of clone stamping and some determination, I've gotten it down to this, which is close to the eye, but not exactly. So I'm thinking maybe I can use warp to push it inwards. Now that my bad shading is revealed, I'm gonna have to go fix that. Alright, let's finish this icon. We can just add a color layer and then set it to either color or hue, and in this case I think hue looks better. Then all we need to do is add a black and white layer to the eyes. I'm gonna darken the reds because it lets that bloodshot veiny look shine through. Then I'll put all of the teeth into one layer, and I'll put a black and white filter on them as well. And I think that looks pretty cool. I can't wait to see it in game, to be honest. That's gonna be the cool part for me. And SD, if you're watching this, I am sorry. Okay, so we have two icons left, and the first one I want to do is AeonAir. Ignore this, the one we're going to look at is this one. And his icon looks like a little dinosaur, so that's going to be fun. And in my last video, we did download this alligator skin texture, which works pretty well for a dinosaur. So first I'll drag that into here, and to make it different, I'm just going to flip it sideways. Because I want to do it right now, I'm just going to recolor it. But we're also going to need an eye. And honestly, I don't know which kind of eye I want, so I'm just going to look up an animal eye. Now this eye seems like it would fit in really well with our alligator scales. And this icon also has this belly, which we're going to need another texture for. Reptile belly might work. There we go. This is a good texture for this. And what's funny is it's a crocodile, which works. And before we put any of these in there, we have to rename them. And now that we have, we can drag those two into Photoshop. Like usual, I'll fit this skin around the icon. And if I distort it a little and then warp, then I can push it around the edges. And I can fit it onto this belly in a 3D looking way. And I'll put a layer mask on that and then fill it in on this stomach area. The last thing I gotta put in is this eye. I'll turn down the opacity so that I can overlay it exactly on top, and I'll rotate it. And now I can meticulously go through and cut out all of the skin using the pen tool. And let's make the eye not orange. I also want to go in and push the edge in for this stomach. And there are also places like this blue pattern in the arm and the mouth where the skin will overlap and it needs to be a different texture. So I'm actually going to drag in this alligator skin texture another time, and I'll paint it in those areas. I can just paint these in over the overlapping areas and then fade them out with the soft brush. And for the arm and the mouth part, just so that they stick out a little bit more, I'll do the same thing where I push in the texture from the outside. And you can see that it kind of makes it look a little bit more 3D. And before we get to shading this, I'm just going to go ahead and recolor the areas that need to be recolored. And those include this eye, these spikes back here, and then the stomach as well. Now that all the colors are right, I can add an exposure layer and then invert the mask. And now we can get to shading this thing. I'll keep it simple and match the other icon's lighting by putting the shadows on the undersides of things. And this is where we can really give give those extra appendages some depth. Also add some shadows behind the eye here, because it'll make it pop out more. And I'll even add some overall shadows to this whole thing. I think doing it here is going to help the transition between the stomach and the body. And I need to make this arm cast a shadow as well. And I can even kind of separate the head from the chin, which is another thing I need to round out with the shadow. But the weirdest thing to me right now is that he still has no mouth. So what I'll do is select this area where we drew in the mouth, and then just so I know where it is, I'm going to paint a light shadow on top. And it kind of already makes sense, but we can make it look way better by adding a darker shadow. It kind of looks weird, but I think I'll go into the highlights and then come back to it later. I'll highlight the top of this alligator eye and add some to this ridge as well. Then I can put some on the top of the head and even this lip under the eye. I just tried something that makes this guy look really smug, but it also makes the mouth look a lot better. And all that is adding a highlight right there. Then I can fade out the bottom and also get rid of some of the shadow underneath. And to me, that made his mouth look a lot better. But this stomach might have some highlights on the top of each ridge, which I can quickly add in and then just fade out the bottoms afterwards. To accentuate that shape, I'm going to add some bigger highlights to the top, and then I'll add shadows on the bottom of each ridge as well. And that just shows how much some shading can really do, which makes me want to go back to the mouth and add some darker shading on the bottom of it. Maybe even some brighter highlights on the top of it. That mouth does seem to go down a bit further than I have it, so I'm going to continue that highlight down there. And that definitely made it look a lot more like his icon. Maybe I can also add some shading in between the patterns, perhaps some highlights on top of them as well. I can even add some highlights on this arm to make it a bit more 3D. That looks pretty cool. I think everything is working well together, but I do want to add a camera raw filter on top. So I'm going to hit convert to smart object, and then using a camera raw filter, I'm going to be able to go in and change these hue, saturation, and luminance values. And I want to make it a bit more saturated and a bit brighter in the oranges. And comparing this icon to the one on the left, I want to make the colors as similar as I can. That means making the aquas a bit brighter, but also a lot more saturated. Same goes for the blues. I can even turn up the texture here, while also turning the exposure up just a little bit. This is before and this is after. I can't wait to see that in game, but we do have one more that we have to do. Let's look up Vortrox's icon. Honestly, my first thought is that it's just Batman, right?
I'm Batman.
But another thing that you might find when you look it up is that he has this profile picture that shows it in a lot more detail. So I'm actually going to use this as most of my reference. Now with Batman, I feel like his suit is usually rubbery. I'm going to get a rubber texture. And this one seems to be the right consistency. Now, I also want a man staring with a smile. And you know what? We're not going to see much of the face, but I do think the bottom jaw will work good for this one. I don't really like that smile though, so I'm going to look up a creepy smile maybe. But we have to name our files, and after that we can drag them all into Photoshop. Now I'm absolutely ready to make an abomination, so let's cut out these teeth. Then we can put it on top of our icon that already is a bit of an abomination in itself. Now if we rasterize this layer and apply the layer mask, we can use a puppet warp and pin the corners to the edges of the mouth. And then when we drag down the middle, it'll form around the area. So if I add a mask to the teeth layer, I can then hit Control I and it'll invert it. Once you've inverted that layer mask, you can go ahead and use a white brush to paint in the area that you want to fill in. And it looks a bit strange, but there is something that I'm missing, and that's these overlapping teeth. So I'm just going to look up fangs. This skull is kind of creepy, so I'm going to use it. Now we can pretty easily select these fangs with the pen tool, and I'll just put these in place right over top of where they're supposed to be. Now using this reference, I'm just going to liquefy them into place and make sure they fill out the area that this outline takes up, and then recolor the teeth in the background to be a bit less saturated. Now it looks a little odd right now, but we can fix that later with some shading. Before that though, I want to add the rubber texture that'll make it look like he's wearing a mask. And it may be hard to know where to start with that, but I'm just going to start by going to liquefy, selecting the original reference to paint on top of, and simply pushing around this rubber texture until it fits the crevices and cracks of this face. And that means things like pushing up on these cheekbones a little bit and down on this eyebrow ridge as well. And now we have an abomination, but we can also turn that into something very cool. And I'm going to start that by adding his chin. Now I know what you're thinking. The original doesn't have a chin. Why should I add a chin? But I think that the original doesn't have a chin as a design choice to make it more readable. So I'm going to use some creative liberties, and I'll just add that cutout around the chin like Batman. But first I'm just going to remove the inside of his mouth. And now, because we made him bigger, he can have those teeth that we put in the beginning. And he needs to be even bigger, so I'm just going to hit liquefy, and I'll use that original icon reference to kind of shape it how I need. I've made a lot of horrifying things, but I think this will be the worst. And let's see how it... I'll put the rubber over all of that, and I'm going to cut out the area that'll actually show the chin. I'm going to take the opportunity to also cut out these eyes. Now before we put in the eyes or anything, I'm just going to start shading so that I can show you how to make it take form. And I imagine the light would come from above, so I'm just going to paint under the mask. I'll add some harsher shadows on the sides of the mask, and then I'll also put a shadow on the bottom, and then push up the skin on the bottom until it fits into a cube shape. Can't stop laughing at this. It looks so dumb. Now we also have to think about the shadows that these teeth would cast. And as the tooth gets further away from the skin, we'll use bigger brushes and we'll make it a lot lighter. I also want to add some shading to the fangs, so I'll paint on the underside of these too. And you know what? I'll also add a contact shadow at the top. And if I put shading in a ring around it like this, then it might look like it's sticking out of the skin a little bit, which is kind of creepy, but gotta do what you gotta do. I'll go ahead and shade these teeth too, which means giving each tooth that collides with another its own contact shadow, and obviously adding a big shadow underneath the lip too. These deeper parts on the side are also going to be a lot darker, and I'll even add an extra exposure layer just to add shading under these teeth and around the entire mouth just to make it a little bit darker. Now this is looking pretty great so far, but obviously we're missing a little bit on the top of the head. Now one thing that's clearly missing from this icon are the eyes. So let's move on to this big nose bridge and eyebrow ridge that we have. And I'm just going to mold it exactly around the top of this head. Importantly though, I'm going to warp it around this line instead of the outside. And actually I meant to do it around this profile picture, so let's mold it around that instead. And you can see how that shapes around the entire area. So we'll go ahead and paint that eyebrow ridge, hit G, and then fill it all in. These edges are really going to have some dark contact points, and in areas where the texture is under this other texture, we're going to have a big shadow casted overneath. Hello. We're going to cast a shadow underneath these big ridges. Also put some shadows around the eyes. It's looking a little flat, so I'm going to go around the edges and add some shadows there too. Let's add some shading on these eyes. And I'll even add some deeper shading where it looks like it should contact the eye a little bit more. I'll start by shading in underneath the eyebrow ridge and just blocking out that form so that I can use it as a reference. And now when I turn off this icon, I can see where exactly I have to line everything up. And of course, underneath the nose, there's going to be a lot of shadow. I can also make it look a little less flat though by adding a bounce light underneath. And I don't know if it makes sense to have a bounce light there, but it looks cool, so I'm going to keep it. And you know what? I'm going to make the entire top level a little bit brighter than the bottom. Now I'll round out the bottom of this eyebrow ridge, and I'll even add some bounce light there too. Now that we have all the shading done, it's time to move on to the highlights. It's pretty much the same shading process, but backwards, because now we're thinking about where the light is hitting rather than where it's getting removed. If I paint all over the top here, I can just fade it right back out. Now also on his profile picture, you can see that there are a lot of ridges around these eyes. So I'm thinking we use a highlight to show the top of that area, and we can do the same over here. I'll add some ridges to the top, which also gives it a little more definition. Now that you know how the highlights work, I'm going to add them to the mouth, teeth, and eyes, especially on these weird fangs that have a long streak of highlights down the middle. I'm going to add a nice highlight to the top left of this eye, and just like the feedback the graphic designers get all the time, it'll help it pop out a little bit more. Now the eyes on Vortrox's icon are mint. I'm going to make a solid color above the layer of the eye, and I'll set it to overlay. Now I'm also going to duplicate that layer and set it to linear dodge add, and when I invert that mask, I can paint a circle around these eyes, and now it really looks like they're glowing. However, none of the surrounding material is affected by it yet. So I'm actually going to move that to the top of the layer list. And I'm going to use this layer to paint in some highlights on the edges where light might hit coming from the eye. And we'll also add some rim lighting to this mask material. The last thing I need to do to make that glow perfect is add it to this eyebrow ridge as well. I don't know what to do with the skin yet, but let's make the teeth mint. Now it's starting to look a bit more like Vortrox's icon, but I think that the skin color makes it make no sense. So I'm actually going to make it all one color and just make it brown. That way the red doesn't clash too hard with these bright colors. And this looks like a pretty great icon to me, so I'm going to go ahead and send it over to Vortrox, maybe during his stream, to see if he'll react. Hey, it's me, guy who changes his setup every 5 minutes. What I said was kind of foreshadowing, because after that, I did send Vortrox's icon live on stream, so here's my reaction to his reaction.
Yo, M. Nursen, thank you for the $10, brother. Wait! Yo, M. Nursen, you're the one who makes the hyper-realistic icons. Wait, I actually want to see that. Hold on. This is important, guys. M. Nursen, what did you create? Can y'all see this? Oh my god, wait. How do I pull this out? This is horrifying. Why is it like this? Why does he have, like, a face? Why does he have a face? This is scaring me. Yo, I'm not even gonna lie. This is absolutely scary. That is extremely scary. Thank you for the $2. I think I just pooped my pants looking at the icon.
Stop. I know you're about to click off the video, but I promised you something, and that's that we're going to try out these icons in-game. And first I want to try RobTop's icon. First I want to try it with the realistic background, and oh my god, this is really starting to look like a rip-off of Geometry Dash. This one, there's not much about it. It's just the RobTop icon with a little bit of 3D-ness to it, I guess. Looks cool in Lottie on Ship, though. And I think the next one we made was Mulpan, so I'm going to try that. Oh my god. It looks way better than I expected. And of course, I have all of these in the description as textures. I don't know how to make it a geode texture pack, but as long as you're on PC, you can use it. And next up, it's SDSlayer, so we have to play Finger Dash. It's perfect. I really love how all these turned out. They're all looking great in game. I think the finger texture kind of made it look like clay from a distance, which is cool. It looks crazy in the ship. We only have 2 more icons, and one of them is AeonAir's. Wow, this is probably my favorite one just because of the shading. He's just taking a little ride in the ship. And last but not least, we have Vortrox. Yes. Now this one honestly might be my favorite. I think it turned out great. Here he is flying in a ship. I forgot they could also be in a UFO. This caught me off guard. But anyway, that's the end of this video, and please go follow me on my Twitter because I'm trying to get 50 followers and I only need -4 more.
Yo, y'all gotta look at this guy's channel. He makes funny videos.